Imagine you work a real job. You wake up at 7 a.m., commute, sit through meetings, answer emails, deal with a boss who probably doesn't appreciate you, and at the end of the month, your bank account barely moves. Maybe you save a little, maybe you don't. But here's what's wild. Right now, there are people sitting in their bedrooms, in their pajamas, buying and selling virtual items inside a video game and making more money than you. Not side hustle money, not pizza and Netflix money. I'm talking rent money, car payment money, in some cases, quit your job money. And the craziest part? The economy they're operating inside of has its own currency, its own banks, its own stock market, its own billionaires, and most financial experts don't even take it seriously. That's exactly why we're talking about it today. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about the places money hides when no one's looking. If you're someone who assumes real wealth only gets built in the real world, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up, because after this video, you're going to question what the word real even means when it comes to money. Let's get into it. Here's the thing. When most people hear the words video game economy, they picture a kid spending their mom's credit card on Fortnite skins. And look, that's a real phenomenon. The gaming industry pulled in over $184 billion in 2023, according to Newzoo's Global Games Market Report. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about money flowing into games. I'm talking about money flowing out. I'm talking about a functioning, breathing, chaotic, and surprisingly sophisticated economy that exists entirely inside a game called EVE Online, and what it teaches us about real money, real psychology, and the real reason most people never build wealth. Now, you might be thinking, Nick, this is a video about a video game. Why should I care? And that's a fair objection. So let me flip it on you. What if I told you that EVE Online has a functioning central bank, employs a real credentialed economist with a PhD as their official economist, publishes quarterly economic reports that read like something the Federal Reserve would put out, and once experienced a single battle that destroyed over $300 million worth of in-game assets in one day? What if I told you that the psychological traps, the wealth-building principles, and the economic mistakes that happen inside this game are identical, almost perfectly identical, to the ones happening in your real financial life right now? Because here's what most people don't realize. Money is not paper. Money is not metal. Money is not even a number in a bank account. Money is a story. Money is a shared agreement. Money is a psychological construct that only has value because enough people decided it does. And nowhere makes that clearer than a game where people have spent 2 decades building one of the most complex economies ever studied, inside a fictional universe in outer space. Let's start from the beginning. EVE Online launched in 2003. It's a science fiction, massively multiplayer online game where players fly spaceships, mine asteroids, build corporations, wage wars, and trade resources across a universe with over 7,000 star systems. And unlike most games where the developers control the economy, setting fixed prices, handing out rewards, balancing everything neatly, EVE Online's developers, a company called CCP Games, made a decision early on that changed everything. They decided to let the players run the economy themselves, almost entirely. The developers mine resources into the game, but what happens after that, that's up to you. Players set the prices. Players control the supply chains. Players build the factories, run the trade routes, corner the markets, and yes, players crash the markets too. What emerged wasn't just a game mechanic. What emerged was a living, evolving, brutally honest mirror of real-world capitalism. And it got so complex, so sophisticated, so genuinely difficult to understand that in 2007, CCP Games hired Dr. Jofus Gudmundsson, an actual economist with a real PhD, to be their in-house economist. His job? Study the EVE economy like you would study a real national economy. Track inflation, monitor supply and demand, publish quarterly reports, identify manipulation and monopolies. This man had a real salary, a real title, and a real responsibility, all to study the economy of a video game. And his reports read like academic papers, because they were. This is where it gets interesting. The EVE economy at its peak had a GDP, yes, a gross domestic product, estimated by economists to be in the hundreds of billions of ISK, which is the in-game currency. But ISK converts to real dollars through a mechanism called Plex, which is a tradable in-game item that players can buy with real money or earn through gameplay and exchange for subscription time or in-game currency.
At various exchange rates throughout EVE's history, the real dollar value flowing through this economy has been staggering. Some estimates place the real-world value of in-game assets and currency over $1 billion when you account for the Plex market. $1 billion inside a video game that people built from scratch using the same psychological instincts and economic behaviors they use in the real world, including all the dumb ones. Now, let's talk about the psychological part, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely useful for your real financial life. Here's the thing about EVE Online. It is, without question, one of the hardest games ever made. Not hard like the controls are complicated. Hard like the game will destroy everything you've built, take all your money, and feel absolutely no remorse about it. And the reason it's that hard is because it's run by other people with real incentives and real greed. There's a famous saying inside the EVE community: never fly what you can't afford to lose. Think about that for a second. In EVE, if your ship gets destroyed, it's gone, permanently, along with everything in it. There's no reload, there's no respawn with your gear intact, you lose it. And because ships can cost hundreds of hours of work, or real dollars through Plex, the emotional weight of that loss is real. Players have described genuine grief, genuine rage, genuine depression after losing a major ship or a stockpile they spent months building. And here's what the economists studying EVE found. The behavioral patterns around loss in EVE are nearly identical to the behavioral patterns around financial loss in real markets. Loss aversion. You've probably heard this term. It was popularized by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their groundbreaking research on behavioral economics. The core finding is this: the pain of losing something is psychologically about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. Losing $100 feels about twice as bad as winning $100 feels good. That asymmetry drives some of the most destructive financial decisions people make. Holding on to losing stocks too long because selling feels like admitting defeat. Refusing to cut losses on a bad investment because the loss hasn't become real until you sell. Taking on more risk to get back to even after a loss, which is how a lot of people turn a $5,000 loss into a $15,000 loss. And in EVE, researchers found this playing out in almost perfect parallel. Players who lost a significant ship showed a statistically higher tendency to take riskier actions immediately after, flying more expensive ships into more dangerous areas, taking trades they normally wouldn't, making impulsive decisions driven by the emotional need to recover what they'd lost. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what happens in real trading. That's the revenge trade. That's the gambler's fallacy in action. That's the same wiring, firing in the same way, whether the currency is ISK or dollars. Now, let's talk about the wealth gap inside of EVE, because this might be the most uncomfortable part of the whole video. EVE Online has an internal wealth distribution problem that makes real-world inequality look modest by comparison. A 2013 economic report from CCP, publicly available, showed that the top 1% of EVE players controlled somewhere around 30% of all liquid wealth in the game. The top 4% controlled over half. Now, those numbers might ring a bell, because real-world wealth distribution looks eerily similar. In the United States, the top 1% of households hold about 30% of all wealth, according to Federal Reserve data. The top 10% hold over 65%. And here's what's wild. Nobody designed it that way in EVE. The developers didn't program inequality into the game. It emerged, organically, from the decisions and behaviors of players operating freely in an economic system, which tells you something deeply uncomfortable about wealth accumulation. It doesn't require conspiracy. It doesn't require cheating. It doesn't require a rigged system in the explicit sense. It requires compounding advantages. It requires that people who start with more can generate more, protect more, and leverage more. And over time, the gap doesn't just persist, it widens. The EVE billionaires, and yes, there are ISK billionaires, some sitting on wealth equivalent to hundreds of real dollars, others sitting on wealth equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars, didn't get there by grinding harder than everyone else. The most common path to extreme wealth in EVE is what players call trade alts, characters dedicated entirely to market manipulation, arbitrage, and cornering supply chains for specific resources. Sound familiar? Because that's not grinding. That's capital allocation. That's investing. That's the same fundamental strategy that builds generational wealth in the real world. Put your money to work so your time doesn't have to be the limiting factor. Here's what most people don't realize about the Eve economy and what it reveals about your wallet. In Eve, there's a player-run institution called the Eve Central Bank, or at least player coalitions that function exactly like a one. Large player groups, called alliances, control entire regions of space and tax the economic activity happening in their territory. They collect taxes on trade, on manufacturing, on mining operations. They use that tax revenue to fund military operations, to build infrastructure, to subsidize industries that benefit their alliance. The parallels to real government economics are literally so direct that economist professors have literally used Eve Online as a teaching tool in university courses. And just like real economies, the Eve economy has experienced inflation crises, supply chain disruptions, market crashes, and economic warfare. In 2021, CCP made changes to resource scarcity in the game, deliberately reducing the supply of key minerals, and the result was a years-long economic recession inside the game. Manufacturing slowed, ship prices spiked, smaller players got squeezed out. Wealthier players with stockpiles made fortunes, just like a real commodity supply shock. Just like what happened with global supply chains during the pandemic, the mechanism was identical. Now let me give you the real financial lessons buried inside all of this, because I didn't bring you here just for a history lesson. Lesson 1. Scarcity is the engine of value, and whoever controls supply controls wealth. In Eve, the players who figured this out earliest became the wealthiest. They didn't mine more, they bought mining output from others, controlled the refinement process, and created choke points in the supply chain. In the real world, this is why businesses that own distribution, not just production, tend to generate the most durable wealth. It's why Amazon's real money isn't in retail, it's in AWS, the infrastructure that everyone else pays to use. Control the pipes, and you collect the toll. Lesson 2. Most people trade time for ISK forever and never escape. There's a term in Eve for players who just grind missions day after day, slowly accumulating currency without ever building systems or structures that generate passive income. The community has a slightly uncharitable name for these players, but the financial archetype is one you probably recognize. They're the real-world equivalent of someone who works hard, earns decent money, but never invests, never puts capital to work, never builds anything that generates returns without their direct labor. The income stops when the effort stops. And in Eve, just like in real life, the grinders watch the traders and manufacturers and market manipulators accumulate wealth at a rate that feels almost unfair. Because it is fast, but it's also learnable. Lesson 3. Emotional discipline is worth more than intelligence. The players who last longest and accumulate the most in Eve are almost never the ones who play the most hours. They're the ones who make fewer emotional decisions. They're the ones who don't revenge trade after a loss. They're the ones who can look at a market opportunity, do the math, take a position, and hold it without panicking when prices temporarily move against them. Patience as a financial asset is radically undervalued, in Eve and in your brokerage account. Now you might be thinking, okay Nick, this is all fascinating, but I don't play Eve Online. What does any of this have to do with my actual financial life? And look, fair, but here's the thing. You are already playing a version of this game, right now, whether you know it or not. The economy you live in operates on the same principles: supply and demand, scarcity and abundance, compound growth, loss aversion, the psychology of status spending, the wealth gap that emerges not from conspiracy but from compounding advantages, the trap of trading time for money without ever building systems. You're inside the game. You just don't have a mini-map showing you the mechanics. And that's actually the most dangerous position to be in, because the players in Eve who get wiped out fastest are the ones who don't understand the rules of the economy they're operating inside. They assume good intentions from other players. They assume prices are fair. They assume that working hard automatically translates to accumulating wealth. They find out, painfully, expensively, that none of those assumptions are automatic. And the financial graveyard of the real world is full of hardworking people who made the same assumptions. So what do you actually do with this? 3 things. First, start thinking like a manufacturer, not a miner. In Eve terms, stop selling your raw time and start building systems. This doesn't mean quit your job tomorrow. It means every paycheck you receive, a percentage of it should be going to work somewhere that doesn't require your active participation. Index funds, real estate, a business with some scalability, something. Because as long as 100% of your income requires 100% of your time, you are permanently one health crisis, one layoff, one bad month away from financial stress. Second, study your own loss aversion. The next time you're holding a position, financial, business, even a relationship decision, and you feel resistance to cutting it loose despite clear evidence it's not working, ask yourself honestly, am I holding this because it still makes rational sense, or am I holding this because selling means admitting the loss is real? That emotional distinction is worth thousands of dollars to develop, maybe more. Third, find the choke point. In every industry, every market, every niche, there is a part of the supply chain that everyone else depends on. Find it. Position yourself there. This is not a complicated advice, but it is uncommon advice because most people are too focused on the immediate transaction, how do I make money this month, to zoom out and ask, where in this system does money consistently collect? The answer to that question is worth more than any single hustle. Here's the final thought I want to leave you with. The fact that a group of people built a billion-dollar economy inside a video game and that it mirrors real economics almost perfectly with the same inequality, the same crashes, the same psychological traps, the same paths to wealth should tell you something profound. The rules of money are not arbitrary. They are not rigged against you specifically. They are consistent. They are learnable. And they play out the same way whether the currency is ISK or dollars or seashells on a beach, because the currency was never the point. The behaviors were always the point. The psychology was always the point. The people winning inside Eve are winning because they understand incentives, they control their emotions, they build systems instead of just grinding, and they position themselves at choke points. That is not a video game strategy, that is a wealth strategy, and it works in your zip code, in your industry, in your bank account, right now. The game is already running. The only question is whether you're playing it or just surviving it. I'll see you in the next one.